Hi friend, my name is Eric Carter Londine, and I am the host and producer of True Consequences podcast. This is not your typical true crime podcast. You see, my brother was murdered over 3 decades ago in New Mexico, and I have been fighting for justice for him ever since. I created this show to advocate for my brother's case and for others in my community who are seeking justice. I cover cases with an empathetic lens because I know what it's like to seek justice for a family member. True Consequences covers cases from New Mexico and the American Desert Southwest. Give my show a shot. You can listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts, or you can go to trueconsequences.com. Thanks for listening and stay safe.
You're listening to Campus Killings, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Citizen Detective. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This episode takes us to Harvard University, where a brutal murder goes unsolved for almost 5 decades. Jane Britton was the daughter of a senior administrator at Radcliffe College, which is a sister school of Harvard College. Her mother, Ruth, was a medieval history scholar at the Radcliffe Institute. She also had a brother named Boyd, and she was very close with her brother and had a good relationship with both of her parents. Jane graduated from Dana Hall, which was an exclusive private all-female high school in Wellesley. And she did a lot. She was very accomplished. She rode horses. She painted. She played the piano. She was a chef. She played the organ. Not surprisingly, Jane had graduated magna cum laude from Radcliffe on June 14th, 1967, with a degree in anthropology.
Wow. She's really accomplished. That's like a phenomenal amount of things to have done in that short period of time.
And she was, it seemed, seemingly successful in all of that she did as well. Someone like her, you're not going to be surprised to know that she then matriculated immediately into the PhD program at Harvard, working to get her doctorate in anthropology. Her boyfriend, Jim Humphreys, was also a grad student in the anthropology program, and he was from Canada. The two were dating for about 8 months at the time of this story. They had met at one of those archaeological digs that they sometimes take anthropology students on.
They sometimes still do archaeological digs for, like, you know, the forensic anthropologists who are like studying bones and things like that.
Yeah, so she met her boyfriend at a dig in Iran where they were looking for ancient treasures, which sounds super cool.
Oh, wow.
Now, the two had been apart for the first semester, and because Jim had returned to Canada, and they only saw each other a few times during this period, but they reportedly had a very strong relationship. The New York Times contemporary coverage says Jane led a zestful life with a taste for cooking, literature, Bach, and painting. The walls of her apartment were covered with animals. She was also described as being witty, bright, sophisticated, and full of self-confidence. She was very close with her across-the-hall neighbors, the Mitchells, Don and Jill. They were close friends of Jane. Since they lived so close, they actually shared her refrigerator with her. So they pretty much would come and go as they pleased from her apartment. They all spent a lot of time together, and they said that Jane was smart, mannerly, and down to earth. So all around, Jane seems very well-adjusted, very bright, has a lot going for her. She had recently been home for winter break and had just returned to campus to prepare for exams, which we know very well, Megan, is a very stressful time for graduate students. She had been home for winter break and had returned to campus to start getting ready for exams. 2 days later, on Monday, January 6th, spoken to her parents on the phone, and she was extremely happy because Jim had just finally returned to campus, and now the two were in the same place, and they were both in the same program. Unfortunately, this would be the last time her parents ever spoke to her. On Monday, January 6th, Jane and her boyfriend Jim and a few friends went to dinner at a restaurant in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, Jane was reportedly very nervous about her big exam the next morning, but the dinner kind of got her mind off of things, and the group had a nice time. Her and Jim also left on their own at around 7:30 to stop at her apartment so she could change into warmer clothing because the two then went ice skating at a small rink. They were there for about 20 minutes or so, but it was just simply too cold to continue. So they headed to a local pub named Charlie's. They had a beer. This is a place that Jane often went to. It was one of those regular student hangouts. It was right across the street from her building.
I never could do that thing that some people did, like study for an exam and then let it go the night before. Like go out and like let it off. I obsessed over it. I had to study like all night until, I fell asleep. I could never let it go. And I hear that and I hear people say that. I'm like, I wish I could have been the person to just kind of like, all right, you've done what you can do now. And, try to like enjoy a little bit.
Yeah, I think that speaks to probably how capable she was, that she was able to still go out and have fun and, be ready for this big exam.
Yeah.
Around 10:30 that evening, the two went to Jane's apartment. They smoked, had some hot chocolate, and talked about their upcoming exams. Now, Jim left the apartment around 11:30 because, again, they had these exams in the morning, so they had to get some sleep. At this point, Jane went across the hall to her neighbors, Don and Jill Mitchell, whom I mentioned before. She went there to get her cat because they had borrowed her cat. Some would say this would be like cat sitting, but you don't really need someone to watch your cat for a few hours. So it seems like they more just liked the cat. So they like borrowed it.
That's cute. I like that.
The trio shared a glass of sherry and Jane went back to her place around 12:30 a.m., now January 7th. And on that morning, January 7th, Jane did not show up for her exam. Now, this got everyone worried, especially her boyfriend, Jim, who knew that there was no way that Jane would miss this exam. But Jim did stay and take the test, and after the exam, around 12:20 p.m., Jim headed over to Jane's apartment. He had tried calling her throughout the day, but he had received no answer. He was really worried at this point because he couldn't understand why she wouldn't have shown up for the exam. As you could imagine, exams aren't something that, Harvard PhD students just blow off lightly.
I don't think so. What was the year again on this? You said he was calling her throughout the day.
So, yes, this was in 1969.
He was calling her from home phone or payphones then?
Yes, definitely. No cell phones at this point. So Jim didn't know. Was she sick? Why wasn't she answering her phone? So he went to her apartment and banged on her door. Now, Don and Jill next door heard the noise and came out. When there was no sign of Jane, they started getting worried. Jill and Jim decided that they would enter the apartment. Now, the door was unlocked because apparently this was normal, again, because the Mitchells shared a fridge with Jane, so they would often leave the door unlocked.
That becomes a theme in a lot of these cases, especially based on the time periods that we cover, is that people left the doors unlocked, which is interesting because that would never occur to me now to ever leave my door unlocked. Different times, I suppose.
Yep. So the trio entered the apartment and Jim walked into Jane's bedroom. Jane was laying face down on the bed and her cat was lying next to her. She was wearing a light blue nightgown that was pulled up and her head and torso were covered with a fur coat, a rug, and a sheet, and her legs were touching the floor. Now, they just assumed that she was ill. It seemed strange the way she was laying, but there was no sign of a struggle or no blood or anything. So Jill, she told Don, she said, something's not right, call health services. So then Don had gone in the room as well to check things out. Now, Don pulled the pile of rugs and fur off of Jane. That's when the bloody scene was apparent, and there was a visible laceration to her scalp. And it was clear that Jane was deceased. A touch to the back of her knee confirmed it. She was cold to the touch. At first, they just assumed that Jane was ill, but then quickly they realized it was a lot more than that because what happened was Don went in and Don pulled off the rugs and the coat that were covering her. And that's when it was apparent what had happened because there was blood everywhere and there was a visible laceration to Jane's scalp. A touch to the back of Jane's knee confirmed that she was deceased. She was very cold. So at this point, they called the police. Megan, believe it or not, Cambridge did not have 911 back then. So they actually had to look up the phone number for the local precinct in their phone book.
Oh, wow. We discussed that once. I think maybe it was a Women in Crime episode where there was also not the access to 911. You was part of your case. You told us when
Angela Samota.
That's right. Okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, my goodness. Wow. I can't. Yeah. We definitely take these things for granted.
Yep. 2 Cambridge police officers responded to the scene. And at the time, Jill, Don, and Jim were waiting for them. Detective Lieutenant Leo Davenport soon arrived, and he would head up the investigation. He was also the head of Cambridge Police's 18-man Bureau of Criminal Investigations. So he was the acting chief of the homicide division, so it was clear that this was the person who was going to be the head of this investigation. You would think that they would know then that they should have secured the apartment, but in fact, they did not secure the apartment. And the Mitchells and Jim were just kind of walking around the apartment, looking around, and it's unclear how much the crime scene was disturbed, but it's very clear that it was not secured. Don had to make the unfortunate call to Jane's parents, and they soon arrived to the scene, and they were allowed to see their daughter's body. And Jane's mom sobbed, and she said she just could not understand why anybody would do this. So not only did Jane's parents come to the scene, the medical examiner came as well, and Jane was pronounced officially dead. The report revealed that the cause of death was, quote, the result of multiple blunt injuries of the head with fractures of the skull and contusions and lacerations of the brain. Manner of death, homicide. The autopsy determined that Jane had been struck on the head 5 times with a blunt objects. Now, blows were both to the front and to the back of her head, and she had clearly been hit from all angles and at least twice directly in the face.
Did they find a weapon or something at the scene?
Not yet. Hold on to that question.
Okay.
So Jane also had 2 superficial gashes, one on her forehead that was 4 inches long and one on the bridge of her nose that was about 1 inch long. She had 2 deep wounds on the right side of her head, 1 serious blow to the left side of her head behind her ear. And this was the most significant injury, and it was assumed to have been an injury when she was struck and she was laying on the bed. So there is a theory that perhaps she was asleep when she was attacked, but they're not positive. They're just theorizing at this point.
Okay.
Her scalp was lacerated in that same spot, and the skull underneath was caved in. Her brain exhibited lacerations and contusions, which caused her death by the bludgeoning. She also had a recent contusion on her right arm. Of course, they also did toxicology tests, and these would be very important because they would shed light on the time of Jane's death. Now, Jane's blood alcohol level was 0%, but her stomach alcohol was 0.08%. So if you recall, remember she went to her friend's house and had some sherry.
I was just going to point that out, but okay.
So this is helpful because this suggests that the sherry she ingested at the Mitchells had not had time to metabolize. Therefore, it was clear that she had died very soon after consuming it. So as a result, her time of death was believed to be between 12:30 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. Unfortunately, this was about 10 to 12 hours before her body was found.
I wonder if someone was lying in wait for her in the apartment. That's what it makes me think if she got home at 12:30. We'll see.
Her funeral was held days later. As we see sometimes, Megan, at the services, a lot of investigators were there, and they were looking closely at every single person there. In fact, they were filming the proceedings with an ancient video camera, mind you, but they were there filming. And we know they do this because they want to see who's there and how they're acting. And the police acknowledged at this point that they had absolutely no leads in the case.
You're probably going to say this, but did they focus on the boyfriend? Because usually the boyfriend would be the first suspect. Or was it pretty apparent that, he wasn't involved?
So before we get to the suspects, Megan, I just want to focus a little bit on the murder weapon and then some other evidence, and then we will do a deep dive into potential suspects.
Okay.
So the murder weapon was believed to be both blunt and sharp. Investigators suggested it was perhaps a hatchet or a cleaver of some sort. Or investigators suggested it could have possibly been an archaeologist type of hammer because there's a specific type of hammer that has both a flat end and a sharp end. But then they also said, well, it could have been a rock. So clearly, they don't know at this point, right? But there was speculation for a few reasons. An archaeological tool, a small axe, was given to Jane by her neighbors, the Mitchells. So they said perhaps that is what killed her because it was missing from the apartment. Now, this axe was estimated to be 6 inches long and 4 inches wide. And the Mitchells had told the police about the gift that they had given Jane and also that they had seen it in her apartment 2 weeks earlier and they don't see it now.
Okay.
However, 2 days later, police said it had been found, but gave no more information. They didn't say if it was in fact the murder weapon, but it was in fact located. It was actually in the bottom of the turtle's tank. So Jane had a turtle tank in her bedroom, and they found the axe in the bottom of the tank.
That's a very weird spot to find the axe.
And actually, they didn't find it. The Mitchells found it because the Mitchells were caring for Jane's pets after she was murdered. And when they were feeding the turtle, they saw that the mini hatchet, everyone believed may have been the murder weapon, was in fact in the tank. Megan, to this day, however, the murder weapon has never been conclusively identified.
Oh, okay. I'm glad to know that because that was one of my questions. Again, like, did we find it? Do we know it? That makes it also a little bit harder to solve this mystery as well, not knowing what, the weapon is and who might have been carrying what type of weapon and where it might come from.
Let's talk a little bit about what the scene looked like. There was a pillow under Jane that was stained with blood, urine, and semen. The semen contained intact sperm cells, a fresh sample, presumably from the killer. Now, this is because her boyfriend, Jim, said that the two were not sexually active in the days leading up to her murder. There was also a piece of wool fabric in Jane's hand and a smear of grease on her right hand. There were traces of blood found on a frying pan and in the kitchen sink. Now, this led some to believe that maybe Jane was first attacked in the kitchen. However, the bed was sprayed with blood, but there was no blood anywhere else in the apartment except for these trace amounts on the frying pan and in the sink. So it's possible that that was from a different incident. Maybe she cut herself while cooking.
Right.
There were really no signs of a struggle in the apartment. And since Jane was clad in a nightgown and no one heard screaming or an altercation, police came to believe that Jane was possibly asleep when she was attacked. Again, Megan, there was also no forced entry because Jane was in the habit of leaving her door unlocked.
This sounds like it's possibly a blitz attack. Someone waited for her to fall asleep and came at her from behind.
Now, there was a table, it was a neighbor's table that was in the hallway of the apartment building, and it was outside of Jane's apartment. The detectives noted that a leg appeared to have been broken off, but nobody knew when or how this had happened. So this table could have been like this for months leading up, or it could have happened that night. But either way, the dimensions of the leg and its attributes being that it was both blunt and sharp metal on one end fit the description of the murder weapon. But again, all of this is speculation because the murder weapon was never identified conclusively. There were also 2 open windows in the apartment, despite the fact that it was January in Boston. One of the windows was in the bedroom and the other was in the kitchen that led to the fire escape. Now, this is significant because a neighbor of Jane's reported that earlier on the evening of the murder, around 9 p.m., a witness heard someone on the fire escape that connected the neighbor's apartment to Jane's apartment. But this person who had heard something reportedly was a 7-year-old, and the 7-year-old was the building super's daughter. So people kind of take this with a grain of salt.
Because children don't always make the most reliable witnesses, but it's still something.
They could, though. Mm-hmm. And Don said that he had gone into Jane's apartment around that time to get a beer, and he saw nothing unusual and certainly no lurking killer. So this ear witness statement was not prioritized by the investigators. Whether or not it should have been, I'm not sure, but it was not. Investigators said that Jane's open windows may have just been because it was so hot in those old buildings. Do you know these old buildings? I don't know if you ever lived in one of these in Manhattan, but I certainly did, where you can't control the temperature. So in the winter, you have the windows open because it is so damn hot.
I lived in one of those and it was so hot. The window never got closed. So yeah, I know exactly what this is.
But then we have Jim, who said that Jane had been having problems with her heat and her apartment had been too cold lately. So that may negate the whole theory that she had opened the windows herself. Initially, no neighbors reported seeing anything unusual. However, that wasn't actually true. There was one Harvard student who lived on the same road who says that he saw 2 men running toward a parked car yelling, "Get to the car, get to the car," around 12:30 a.m., the same early morning in which it is believed that Jane was murdered. A second witness, a transit worker in the area, saw a man who was about 6 feet tall and 170 pounds running on Jane Street around 1:30 a.m. But it was pouring rain at that hour, so the witness didn't think much of it and did not get a good look.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
We want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about our friends over at CrimeCon.
What is CrimeCon, you might ask? It's only the greatest convention in the world of true crime where thousands of people come together to discuss their favorite cases, rub elbows with some of the biggest stars in the world of true crime, and interact with some of their favorite podcasters.
CrimeCon is a great place to meet people just like you who have an interest in true crime, and you get to hang out with some of the biggest names in true crime. People like Nancy Grace, Paul Holes, and Dr. Henry Lee, just to name a few.
It's a 3-day event, and the next one is less than a year away. CrimeCon 2023 will be in Orlando, Florida, at the World Center Marriott, September 22nd to September 24th, 2023. And listeners of Campus Killings can save 10% on your standard badges for CrimeCon 2023 when you use our promo code at checkout when you go to crimecon.com. That promo code is Campus Killings, all one word, no spaces.
Book your trip now before spots sell out. And who knows, maybe we'll see you there in September. So when we think about what's the motive here, it's clear that the motive was not robbery because nothing appeared to have been stolen. There was jewelry, money, and valuables sitting in plain sight that were left untouched. Sexual assault tests were pending, but remember, Jim told the police that him and Jane had not had sex. So if someone else's semen was found, it could have been the killers, but of course it also could have been another man that she was perhaps having relations with. There was also a pair of Jane's underwear that was found on the bathroom floor that had semen stains on it as well.
I mean, this just strikes me as a clear case of sexual assault. Maybe it's not, but that's exactly what I see.
Yeah. Tell me if this means anything to you also. This might give us a clue as to what type of person might have been the offender. There was an ashtray in Jane's room that was sprayed with blood. Now, police believe the killer had stayed and smoked a cigarette after the murder because there was a clean, unsplattered butt that laid in the ashtray.
Yeah, okay. That's always interesting to me because they usually say that would be something that indicates someone's comfortable there. So you know what I mean? That's less of a stranger situation and more of someone who knew they had time. But she lived alone, so in that instance, that also, they probably knew no one was coming over.
Could also just be somebody who doesn't believe that they're going to get caught and just has like a narcissism about them that they think like, I'm above the law, no one's going to get me.
That's a good point.
And remember, for our listeners who are like, oh, good, they have the DNA on the cigarette then. Remember, this is 1969, so nobody's thinking about that just yet.
Right.
Now, it's hard to overstate how much one particular detail of the crime scene derailed the entire investigation. Now, there were traces of a reddish-brown powder that was observed by crime scene technicians, and this powder was sprinkled over the bed and over Jane's body. Now, Jane's nightgown had blood and urine on it, but it also had this red powder on top of it. Some of the powder was also found on the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, and it was clearly fresh. Now, this from the New York Times, quote, "The killer sprinkled the body with a reddish-brown powder believed to have been red ochre, a common pigment used for thousands of years, sometimes in primitive burial rituals. On this basis, the police have been questioning fellow students and others at Harvard who may have been acquainted with primitive cultures." Megan, at this point, they're looking at this powder saying, okay, so this must mean something.
They're attributing too much significance to it at this point.
Well, do we know if it's too much significance? We haven't gotten there yet. However, They're very quick to say, oh, okay, so she was in a major that studied primitive cultures, and there's this dust that often indicates something about a burial ritual. They did also find an unidentified set of prints in the apartment, but it was one unidentified thumbprint, and it was on the window pane in the kitchen, the one that leads to the fire escape outside. So this seems like it would be a big deal, but they were really focusing on this powder. There was much to do about the powder. And partially because there was a Harvard professor who was the department head of anthropology who told the police that this powder could be red ochre, and it was commonly sprinkled in an ancient Persian burial ritual. This gave rise to all sorts of theories that the murder was a ritualistic sacrifice or that it was committed by somebody within the department who was having an affair with Jane. And the media would continue looking into this angle, stating that, quote, "The markings on Miss Britton had all of the appearances of those used in a primitive burial rite. It was described as an ancient symbolic method of purifying the body to get it into paradise and rid it of evil spirits." So they were trying to imply, or the theory was implying, that we're dealing with a very sick person who's committing this crime that's ritualistic in nature. The last media report that I want to read about this powder, because again, I want to reiterate how much stock they put into this one piece of evidence. On April 6, 1969, the Globe reported that, quote, "Her killer placed her clothing in distinct piles and then methodically placed the red ochre on her body in a straight line leading to a rock at the top of her head." So now they're saying that the rock was supposed to be symbolic of a headstone.
Oh, really?
So,
I feel like this is either a red herring or it's just derailing the investigation.
Yeah, well, we'll get to the answer in very shortly, Megan, but
Okay.
I'm going to lean towards red herring on that one. So the question really became, if the killer knew about the anthropological uses of red ochre and or knew of Jane's studies in her field, well, then maybe her killer was somebody that knew her. And police were pretty sure that that was the case. And this professor, the chair of the department, had also told police that he knows where they could find the red powder. It in fact could be found in the Harvard office of another Harvard professor who we'll talk more about in just a minute. Even though the state police did test the chemicals and determine that it was in fact iodine oxide, which is not the same as red ochre, it didn't clear things up, at least in the media. So the crime was very perplexing to everyone. So Jane had not screamed. Nobody had heard her, and people lived in close proximity. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, nothing was taken, yet she had been brutally bludgeoned to death and presumably raped by an unknown assailant. None of this made any sense to anybody. And everyone that knew Jane said she would have fought like hell and she would have screamed. Again, we could always say, right? We don't actually know, but there was a story that some of her friends had told to the police about a time that she was walking alone at night and she had been grabbed by a man on the street. And Jane actually did not scream, but instead she pulled out a knife and slashed the guy and he ran away. So they were saying, based on what she did in previous situations, she's not going to just sit there and let someone victimize her. Okay, something else worth exploring is let's talk about the building that Jane lives in. Now, Jane's building had already been the scene of another murder of a young female graduate student just a few years earlier. Now, this other victim was stabbed to death and a pair of stockings were knotted around her throat. The same lead detective worked that scene as the one who did Jane's scene.
Wow, did they solve that one?
So, interestingly, her death was credited to Albert DeSalvo. You know who that is?
Of course I do. I teach Serial Killer 101.
Yeah, so the Boston Strangler, because he claimed responsibility, as we often see. However, the problem with tying him to Jane's murder was that he was in prison when Jane was killed.
Yeah, this happens a lot, like you said. False confessions by serial killers to several crimes. So it doesn't sound like that's the strongest
No,
theory.
he didn't claim responsibility for Jane's, though.
Claiming responsibility for a victim, we do see that from serial offenders. But yeah, it's so easy to dispel some of these ideas when they're actually in prison.
Yeah, and some people don't even believe that he had killed that other prior victim from the building. But it's important that we look at all possible theories at the time.
Right.
We can't rule out the possibility that the person who killed the previous victim also killed Jane because their apartments were pretty much adjacent to each other. They both had fire escapes outside of their windows. And it's, is it possible that the same killer was back at it? We don't know. The apartment building also came under a lot of scrutiny. So it was a very old brick and limestone building that was owned by Harvard University. They had acquired it a couple of years earlier. However, the building was kind of in a disarray. There was a lot of litter around. There was a garage next door which had shattered windows. There was no lock on the front door at the street levels. Many people described it as the corridors being dark and dreary. The paint was peeling. It was chipped. It was battered. But I don't know. We both lived in New York, and I'm sure other people have lived in apartments that look like this, and that doesn't mean they're unsafe. But in fact, there were no locks on any of the 5 entrances to the building, so that's problematic.
That's concerning.
Yeah, and tenants told reporters that people were able to come in and out freely, and that their complaints had fallen on deaf ears. Finally, after Jane's murder and many resident complaints, the locks were actually fixed. Who cares?
So it only
That's
took 2
irrelevant.
murders in the building to get it fixed?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
right. We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
All right, back to the investigation. So after the red herring or the red powder dead end, who are the suspects here? What are we thinking? So let's talk about some potential theories and some potential suspects, because the investigators were interviewing everybody, other graduate students, friends, colleagues, neighbors, family. Not surprisingly, Jane's boyfriend and her neighbors were of primary interest because they were the closest to Jane, and they were also the ones who discovered her body. Now, they were working hard on this. The police interviewed over 23 people in the first 48 hours and talked to hundreds of classmates and other associates in just the first week alone. They were canvassing the area for the murder weapon. They tried to run prints that were lifted from the apartment. They were checking local reports of other burglaries. They were talking to everyone on that recent dig trip that she had gone on. Before I get into the theory, it's interesting to see some of the old articles that covered the case. The Boston Globe articles covered Jane's death, referring to her as a, quote, attractive 23-year-old girl. And the media in general was fascinated with the case, and the coverage quickly went national. After all, it's a pretty juicy mystery. So speaking of the unknown assailant, the Globe said, was it a work of a sex fiend, a prowler, a crazed psychedelic hippie, a rejected suitor? They're just throwing everything against the wall here.
Right. The salacious part.
Most people that knew Jane suspected that it was a random attack because there was a rise in crime in Cambridge during this time. And also, nobody knew Jane to have any enemies. But regardless, police started with Jane's inner circle. So let's talk about Jim and the Mitchells, who, again, were the closest people to Jane. Jim told the police about his relationship with Jane, reporting exactly what they had known about the relationship from other people. Jill and Don had told investigators the story about Jane coming over to have some sherry and leaving at 12:30. The Mitchells said nothing seemed out of place. Jane was, acting normal. They heard no noises throughout the night. Jim and the Mitchells were also all fingerprinted, and they agreed to polygraph tests. The police told the media that the polygraphs were voluntary and routine, and they were just there to clear up minor discrepancies. But either way, there was a little bit of, in these situations, everyone becomes a suspect pretty quick.
Of course.
The police also tested the sweater that Jim was wearing that night, the ice skates. Jill's hands were obviously swabbed, and nothing is matching the Mitchells or Jim at this point.
Mm-hmm. I could have guessed that.
Jim also kind of had an alibi for the night of the murder.
What do you mean by kind of?
So he had arrived home before midnight, and he and his roommate had gone to sleep. They slept in the same tiny room, mere feet apart. It was conceivable, though unlikely, that Jim had left and killed Jane in the night, or that his roommate was covering for him, but again, very unlikely.
Yeah, it sounds like actually pretty good alibi.
So regardless of the fact that it seemed very obvious that the Mitchells and Jim had nothing to do with Jane's murder, they kept being re-examined and reinterrogated again and again. But everything checked out, and the three were eventually all ruled out.
Yeah.
Then there was a professor that we mentioned earlier. The professor who had that red powder in his office. Now, this was Professor Clifford Karl Lamberg-Karlofsky. He was an expert in the field of anthropology, and he taught both Jane and Jim. Now, he had showed up voluntarily at the Cambridge police station as soon as he heard about the murder. He told police that she was an extraordinary, capable, and talented girl. She was gifted, and, he seemed shocked about what had happened. Now, we sometimes know that people who voluntarily come into police stations announcing what they know about a victim, sometimes they're usually seen as suspicious. And that's what happened. As soon as Carl showed up at the police station, they wanted to know more about him. Now, they found out he was 31 years old, and he was actually the leader of the excursion that Jane had gone on, that dig excursion.
Right.
In the media, there were reports that there was a lot of fighting among members of the excursion. But Carl said, this wasn't true. There were just little fights here and there anyone would have if they traveled together. Police said that the inquiries into the conflict on the trip really just amounted to mere personality clashes between Jane and someone else, and it was nothing more. So that didn't really go anywhere. But then they found out that Jane had failed one of her exams the previous year when she took Carl's class, and he had told her that if she failed again, she could jeopardize her spot in the program.
Doesn't sound like a motive for him, though.
They spent a decent amount of time talking to Carl, but at the end of the day, they had absolutely no reason to believe that he was at all involved in Jane's murder. Then there was an ex of Jane, a man by the name of Ed. Now, these two had dated during her senior year at Radcliffe, and he had also gone into the Harvard graduate program for anthropology, but he had recently dropped out. So a few of Jane's friends said that this ex was abusive, and then the media got wind of the fact that Jane had had an abortion and that Ed was the father of the baby. The two had broken up in the fall of 1967, and Jane was very upset about it. But this ended up being dead end also because Ed was eliminated as a suspect because the police verified that he was in fact in Peru the weekend that Jane died. So as we see, many rumors are swirling, and, at first glance, there might seem to be a lot of people with motives. Everything just kind of falls. Then there were other faculty members who were questioned, one saying that Jane had rejected him, another saying that they had an affair with her. Again, it's just lots and lots of speculation and lots of rumors about, her being involved with a married professor. And there was just a lot to sift through. But police were sifting through all of this and not finding anything. And the case went cold, unfortunately, pretty quickly. On January 18th, just 11 days after Jane's murder, the district attorney acknowledged that there was, in fact, no progress in the case. And 2 weeks after her death, the Globe ran another article titled, quote, "Psycho, Sex Fiend, Junkie, Still No Clue to Britton Slaying." So again, although all these rumors are dead end, the media still perpetuating them. By the end of the month, the DA resorted to putting the case before an investigative grand jury. Now, there was no specific leads or suspects, but they felt that the subpoena power of the grand jury might flush out some information. And we see that it does sometimes. And they were worried that a lot of the Harvard-based witnesses would soon be moving on. After semesters, people go away, they have trips planned, and they wanted to make sure that they got everyone before they left campus.
Okay.
Unfortunately, nothing came out of this grand jury.
Yeah, I had a feeling that wasn't going to work out, to be honest.
But around the same time, there was another murder in the area. Now, could this have been related? 50-year-old Ada Bean, who lived alone in a third-floor apartment less than a quarter mile from Jane, was bludgeoned to death in her home. Now, police acknowledged that the circumstances were quite similar, but, let me tell you, they were similar because this woman was found on her bed with her night clothes pulled up and a blanket over her head. Her head had been hit with a blunt, heavy instrument, and the weapon was not found. The apartment also did not appear to be in disarray, and the building was unlocked. So it did seem like it was very similar to Jane's murder. Now, investigators did look into reports of a strange man in the area, but her case remained unsolved. Police didn't know who killed her or whether it was the same person who had just killed Jane in an eerily similar crime just weeks earlier. Unfortunately, the connections to this case did not lead them anywhere, and the case hits a brick wall, and there it sat, Megan, for decades.
Right. I can already guess now that it's going to be DNA developments that are going to find whoever did this.
Yes, but not as quick as we would think, because you're not going to believe how long this all took, because at some point in the 90s, the case was reopened by the Massachusetts State Police. Now, they took over from the Cambridge Police Department because they were simply unable to resolve Jane's murder. So we see this, a new set of eyes might be good. And this happened because there were two state police troopers who had just really stumbled upon the boxes of case materials when they were looking through the Cambridge Police Department precinct house. And upon reading the file, they discovered that there were 13 slides from Jane's autopsy that were still intact.
Wow.
And one of them was a vaginal smear with trace amounts of semen. Now, the case was now nearly 30 years old. Even though the evidence was so old, they were able to develop a male DNA profile from the slide. Unfortunately, there was simply not enough for a reliable CODIS result, and therefore none was obtained. Yeah, so CODIS is the Combined DNA Index System, the repository that the FBI maintains of DNA samples. There was not a hit at this point, and then in 2004, they tried again. Now, why did they try again? Because scientific testing evolves. So we see this happening when you have evidence. They'll try, there's no hit, and then they may try again. Because again, they had a partial sample. There was no hit in CODIS at that time in the 90s, but by 2004, it's possible that there could be new DNA in the system that it might hit on. So this time around, they found that the DNA was sufficient for comparison purposes. So in other words, it could rule a potential suspect in or out. So they're moving forward, but nothing happens. They could look back and say like, okay, so it definitely wasn't Jim. It definitely wasn't the Mitchells because they're able to compare it, but it's not proactively helping them find someone. So The case sat cold for another decade and a half. So now by this point, Jane's parents were deceased and her brother had given up hope of ever finding out who killed his sister. We are now close. At this point, you are now close to 50 years since the brutal murder. But Megan, DNA to the rescue.
Yep. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
So in 2017, new tests were conducted yet again. And these seem to have been sparked by several FOIA requests from journalists, including We Keep the Dead Close, author Becky Cooper. Now, that book was one of the primary sources that we used for today's episode.
Okay.
So Becky Cooper was seeking the release of the police files on the cold case. And these were universally refused on the grounds that the case was being actively worked. So they had to at least make a pretense of working on the case if they're going to say that. So it was decided to do one last sweep of the file. They were trying to see, is there anything else that maybe the lab could look at? And yes, in fact, there was. Massachusetts State Police DNA analysts discovered that there were some skin cells on the test tube that held the vaginal smear swab. And a test conducted in October 2017 yielded results.
Okay.
Yeah, so now there was a male-specific profile from the remaining DNA sample. And now that they had this profile, not partial profile, a whole profile, they entered it into CODIS. And guess what, Megan?
They got a hit.
They got a hit. The DNA profile belonged to a serial rapist and murderer named Michael Sumter.
You didn't let me hypothesize.
Oh,
I was
fine.
going
Okay.
to. No, it's
Okay,
okay.
so-
That was going to be, just so you know, that was going to be my assumption. At the end
You
of the
heard
day,
you heard of him before?
the name sounds familiar, but my assumption at the end of the story, after we went through it, was that it was going to be a serial offender and it was going to be a
Gotcha.
stranger. So, okay.
The only problem was that Michael Sumter was dead.
Oh,
But that wasn't all. And the DA's office doesn't seem to like to talk about this aspect of the case, but Sumter's name was in Jane's case file all along. Apparently, there was a soft hit to Michael Sumter in 2004, but this was buried deep in Jane's file. And for some reason, there was very little documentation about this soft hit, other than the fact that it had been done and there was a link between Michael Sumter's DNA and this DNA profile. So even though Michael Sumter was deceased, it's still important to get answers and to know what happened to Jane, right? To close this case and get justice for Jane. So in 2004, apparently they tried to locate Sumter's brother, and had they pursued this lead, the case could have been solved 13 years earlier. So it's unclear why it was not solved. But regardless, now in 2018, it was important to confirm that it was in fact Sumter. So investigators did track down the living brother who shared the same genetic characteristics as the assailant. And the press release says, quote, although Sumter was already deceased, investigators were able to locate and obtain a DNA sample from Michael's biological brother who had the same male profile. Right. Testing on the sample excluded 99.92% of the male population as a contributor of the DNA and confirmed that Michael Sumter's profile matched the profile. And his brother was also excluded as a possible contributor. So when you have this DNA, which is 99.92%, along with circumstantial evidence such as Sumter's record and his MO, they were very confident that this was, in fact, the person who murdered Jane Britton almost 50 years prior. And similar to what you hypothesized, Megan, they believe that he saw Jane when she was out with Jim and followed her home. And he possibly entered her apartment through a window and assaulted and murdered her in her bed before fleeing the building.
So, yeah, he got in and then he waited for her. What do we know about Sumter other than he's the assailant and it seems like he's a serial? What do we know about his background?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot about Michael Sumter. So Michael Sumter was born in 1947. He was the middle child of three. His parents got divorced when he was young, and his mother spent most of his childhood in mental health facilities, and he was raised by his grandparents. But what's really interesting, Megan, is here's a synopsis of his long rap sheet. He was first arrested in 1963 at the age of 15 for larceny. So we see a career criminal or chronic offender.
Yep.
That was followed up by multiple arrests for vehicular larceny, pickpocketing, assault, battery, and so on. His first time served was a 2-month sentence right after he turned 18. And during this incarceration, he had a psychological evaluation that found he had impulse control issues. Surprise.
Yeah.
He got out on parole in 1966, and he worked in Harvard Square, which was right down the street from the scene of Jane's murder.
He was a local, which was, that's not surprising.
He was soon in prison again for using a stolen credit card. He was then paroled and released into the custody of his brother who lived in Boston. And it was then that he killed Jane about 6 months later.
Right.
So Sumter seems to have recognized that his criminal urges needed to be restrained because he told a prison officer that they should keep him locked up. However, 2 weeks later, he was released in December of 1971 when he killed another victim a month later. 3 weeks after that, in 1972, he attacked and raped a woman he met at Harvard Square. He had done time for that crime, so he was apprehended, but he walked away from a 12-hour furlough in 1973. So recall, we're talking about the 70s where violent offenders would often get work furloughs, which means that they could leave during the day to work and then return back to the prison. 3 weeks later, he killed another victim. Again, at the time, nobody knew about these victims. It's in hindsight that we know. Within a few weeks, he was sent back to prison, not for murder, but for the robbery and assault of a police officer. In 1975, he was sent out on work release and walked away yet again. And within days, he assaulted and raped a woman in her apartment in Boston. So as we have heard, Sumter was a violent career criminal, and there's a reason his DNA was in CODIS. But he kept getting released, and the vast majority of his crimes were not even attributed to him during his lifetime. Just like in Jane's case, many of his vicious crimes went cold. The majority of his violent crimes he was posthumously connected to after his death, unfortunately. And again, this was all through CODIS hits. So unfortunately, he would never be held responsible for the majority of his crimes because Sumter had died of prostate cancer in 2001 at the age of 54. 13 months prior to his death, he had been paroled to prison hospice care after being convicted of that 1975 rape of a woman in her apartment. His sentence for that attack was actually 15 to 20 years. Unfortunately, he was only 21 years old when he killed Jane, and he would go on to viciously rape and often murder women who were strangers to him, often selected at random by some unknown demented urge that he had. Unfortunately, he was not alive to answer for many of the crimes he had committed. As I mentioned, Jane's parents had died, so they never got justice for their daughter. Her brother, Reverend Boyd Britton, thanked the state police for keeping his sister's case going after nearly 60 years. And at least there was a member of Jane's family who was able to get closure from this horrific crime. The randomness of this crime really frustrated many people who dedicated years to figuring out who killed Jane. Because again, many people suspected it was somebody close to her. I bet one entity who was likely to be very relieved when they found out that Michael Sumter was connected to the murder was Harvard University, because I am sure that it would have looked much worse if it was one of their own that committed this brutal attack against Jane.
Well, of course.
I think it's safe to say that Harvard-owned residential buildings now have reliable locks and security systems in place, and luckily we don't hear about these things as often as we once did. I think this case has a very simple, very easy, practical takeaway.
And what's that?
Lock your doors. And I'm not at all blaming the victim for leaving her door unlocked, but we can learn from cases like this the importance of opportunity for these offenders. If the windows and doors are locked, they simply move on to somebody else oftentimes.
That's true. But maintenance of the building would have been paramount as well. So, yeah, I'm glad to see. We talked about another case like this in which it was students leaving the doors open, but this one seems more negligent, not having fixed doors and having this, does seem like it would be easy for someone opportunistic to just, I know this building and they're always open.
And this crime in particular is preventable because she was not targeted. It was a crime of opportunity. Mm-hmm. And if the building was not negligent, perhaps Jane would still be alive.
I think the end takeaways here are clear about, crimes being preventable, especially crimes of opportunity. It's a heinous crime. The other takeaway is that we're very fortunate now that we live in, some might think, an over-surveilled society, but we have surveillance, we have other data points, and we have DNA development. So we're fortunate at the very least that we can solve these crimes and identify perpetrators earlier.
Yes, and I'm glad that the police never gave up. I think it's important for them to continue to investigate cold cases until they find a hit.
I agree, and I'm glad to see that they did that in this case, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you for listening today, and we hope you'll join us next time on Campus Killings.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Megan Sachs and Dr. Amy Schlossberg, with research and writing by Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media. You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings, or on Facebook by searching for Campus Killings Podcast. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.